Welcome to the next lesson in Vuex Fundamentals, where we're going to cover another tool in the Vuex library called Actions. To grab the starting code, you can check out the L4-start branch. In the previous lesson, we learned how to update the state in our Vuex store using mutations. Specifically, the add event mutation pushes new events into our events state. This is working well for us so far, but we aren't yet following best practices according to Vue team members. The best practice would be to encapsulate these mutations within something called an action. So what exactly is an action? Actions allow us to program a little more nuanced behavior into our Vue apps. For example, before committing a mutation, we might want to run some conditional logic, or maybe wait for an API call to resolve, and then commit a mutation or not based upon that behavior. So actions essentially allow us to wrap some business logic around our mutations that we either commit or not, depending on what happens with that business logic. If you remember in the first lesson of this course, we looked at a code example where there was an action that contained several mutations. The first mutation set the loading status. Then it ran an API call. And when the response returned, another mutation was committed to set the loading status back to false. And then a final mutation was called to take the response from the API call and add it to the Vuex state. So as we can see, just by calling one action, we're able to perform a lot more complex behavior, including committing some mutations. I know when I was first learning Vuex, the differences between actions and mutations was still a bit confusing. So to help us unpack and separate these concepts, let's look at a real-world metaphor. Let's say I need some bread and I text my friend, "Hey, can you pick up some bread?" There's a big difference between my friend saying sure and then going and fetching the bread versus me actually receiving the bread and having it in my possession. So in this example, the mutation could look like this, where addBread takes the bread and adds it to the state. In other words, I now in fact have bread. Whereas the action would look more like getBread, where if possible, my friend is going to fetch the bread from the endpoint, in this case the market, and then if he's able to get it, we can commit the addBread mutation. Of course, there could be a number of reasons why my friend could not retrieve the bread. Perhaps their car broke down, or the store was out of bread. So an action is like expressing the intent for something to happen, for some state change to be made within our app. And the mutation is what actually performs that state change. It is what fulfills the intent of that action. Hopefully with this silly example, we have more clarity on the differences between actions and mutations. So let's head back into our example app and implement some actions. If we head into the event create component, we'll see from the last lesson that we're directly committing the add event mutation from this component. So let's refactor this, taking the mutation and encapsulating it in a new action. We'll cut out this code block. Then we'll head into our Vuex store file and add our first action called create event. And we'll paste that code in here. There are a few new things that are happening here. First, notice how we're passing in commit here. This is part of the context object, and it gives us the ability to run commits on our Vuex store. Also, notice how we deleted the this.$store. That's because now we're already within the store, so we don't need to access the store as a global object like we would from within a component. Since we've pasted this event service call into our store file, we now need to import the event service into this file, ensuring we're able to run the API calls that live within the event service. Now that our action is ready, how do we actually run it? In Vuex, when we call an action, we are dispatching that action. So now we need to be dispatching the action from our event create component. Within event create, where we were committing the mutation, we're now going to be dispatching the action. So we'll say this.$store.dispatch. And for the first argument, we'll pass in the name of the action that we want to dispatch. And for the second argument, we'll pass in the event. This is the payload that the action will have access to when it runs. We can then delete the import statement for the event service because we're going to be calling all of those event service API calls from within the actions of our Vuex store. Now let's test this out in the browser by creating a dummy event. Now when we head over to the event list, we should see that new event showing up. And there it is. As you can see, we're still successfully creating our events and committing them to the Vuex state. And at this point, if you're thinking, sure, but that was a lot of extra effort, creating those actions and wrapping them around our mutations just to achieve the exact same behavior as before, you might be wondering why. As I mentioned earlier, it is a recommended best practice to do things this way, and it's a best practice for a reason. The reason we should always be wrapping our mutations within actions is because it future-proofs our app, building in scalability from the ground up. For example, right now, you might not need to be running any conditional logic or asynchronous behavior before committing your mutations, but if down the line you end up needing to add that, it's going to be more work to refactor your application and wrapping all those mutations within new actions versus just already having those actions and adding what you need to them. Again, you increase the scalability by building in that flexibility from the get-go. And finally, if you pay attention to conversations that are being had around the next major version of Vuex that's coming down the pipeline, you'll see that there's plans for mutations to go away. So the way that I look at it is if we're writing everything within actions now, when those mutations eventually do go away, it's not as big of a mental shift. So with all of that out of the way, we can continue to refactor our app and add in those actions. Heading into the event list component, we'll see that when this component is created, we're getting all of our events and then adding those to our component's local events data. But these events shouldn't just live locally within this component. Instead, we want them to be part of our Vuex state so that all of our app, any component within it, can access them. So let's take the code here in the created hook and add it within a new Vuex action. We're going to call that new action fetch events, and we'll just paste all that code inside here. And of course, no longer setting a local components data. Once that getEvents call has its response from the mock database, it will then commit a new mutation called setEvents, which is going to set our events state equal to the events we got back from the response. So now when our fetch events action is dispatched, we're running the getEvents API call, then taking that response and committing this new mutation, which adds that response to our Vuex state. Now we just need to write that new setEvents mutation, which simply sets the state's events equal to the events that it was handed by the fetchEvents API call. Now that our fetchEvents action is ready, we can dispatch it from the event list component. So back in the created hook, we'll say this.$store.dispatch fetchEvents. So now whenever this component is created, we're going out and fetching those events and adding it to the Vuex state. But there's one little change we need to make within this component. If we scroll up to the template, we can see that the event card here is v4ing through the events. Previously, it was looping through the events data on this component, which were added from that API call, but now those events live within our Vuex state. So we'll go ahead and delete out this old data property and replace it for a new computed property called events. This will return this.$store.state.events. Now, without changing anything within the template, it still has the events that it needs. Again, now these events are coming from our Vuex state. If you're wondering why we used a computed property here, it's because we wanted these events to be reactive. As I mentioned in our intro course, computed properties will recompute and return a new value whenever its dependencies change. In this case, the dependency is the events from our Vuex state. So whenever that state changes, this computed property is going to recompute, so we will always have the latest version of those events from our state. Next, we'll just delete out this import statement since we're no longer using the event service here, and we'll head into our event details component. We're going to repeat similar steps that we just took for the event list component. We're going to cut out this code and add it within a new action. This action will be called fetch event because it's fetching that single event that was routed to. It will take in the ID of the event that was routed to, which the event service will use to fetch it, and when that response is returned, we will commit a new mutation called setEvent, passing in that response. Now we just need to add the setEvent mutation, which will set the state of a new event property equal to the event that we just retrieved by ID. This will ensure that our app has a currently active event that is available to the components that need it. Now we can go ahead and dispatch this new fetch event action from within the event details component. Similar to the event list component, this component's template is displaying the event, which used to be local component data, but is now Vuex state. So we'll add a computed property called event, which returns this $store.state.event. Now we can delete that old event data and the import statement. To sum up what we just accomplished, when this component is created, we're dispatching the fetch event action, passing in the ID from the props. This gives the API call what it needs to fetch the event that we're displaying by its ID. Over in the Vuex store, once that event is received, we're setting it equal to the event state, and then we're pulling in that state through this new computed property. So there you have it. We've refactored our components to be using actions, and then use computed properties to sync those components up with the Vuex state that they need. Before we go, there is one performance enhancement that I want to cover. What happens when we're on the event list view and we click on an event card? Right now, we're routed to the event details component, which dispatches the fetch event action, with the goal of fetching the event that was just clicked on so we can display it to the user. But what if we already have that event stored within our Vuex state? We can actually save ourselves from making an unnecessary API call by adding a check within the fetch event action. So let's add that performance enhancement to the fetch event action. Within the context object, we'll add state here so that we can create a new const called existing event. This is going to check the event's state that we currently have and see if there's an event that exists within it that has the same ID that we're fetching. We'll then check to see if that existing event const contains an event, and if it does, we'll commit the setEvent mutation using that existing event. Otherwise, if we don't already have that event available to us, we'll go ahead and make that API call to fetch it. And that brings us to the end of the lesson. We covered a lot here, and actions are arguably the toughest thing to understand about Vuex, so congratulations for making it through. So what are we covering in the next lesson? Currently, when we fill out the create event form and hit submit, we aren't routed anywhere. Ideally, we would be routed to that new event that we just created. So in the next lesson, we're going to get that to work, as well as implement a simple yet elegant solution to handle the errors that could happen within our Vuex actions. If you're coding along, you can grab the ending code at L4-end.